Okay, good evening to all of you. What an amazing crowd. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're proud at Beth Jacob to be partnering with the Jewish Journal and David Suissa and the Israel Project and Josh Block and David Chazoni for tonight's event with Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, Wall Street columnist, Bret Stephens. As you all know, Bret Stephens is one of America's preeminent foreign policy thinkers who tackles complex global issues with logic, with intelligence, and with clarity. And so it's a great honor, Bret, to host you and welcome you back to Beth Jacob. Also, we're all very excited about Bret's new book, America in Retreat, and I would say it's a mitzvah to go ahead and buy the book. You haven't done so already. I want to express my appreciation to our Beth Jacob sponsors, Selwyn and Glynis Gerber, and thank them for their generosity and vision in sponsoring tonight's program. Okay, the order of the program briefly is that I'm going to share just another minute or two of brief remarks. Then I'm going to introduce David Suissa to speak, who's going to introduce Josh Block. And then Josh, he'll be introducing Josh Block and Bret Stephens, and Josh is going to be moderating the conversation together with Bret. So firstly, I think it's so meaningful for all of us to join together, Beth Jacob, as a pro-Israel religious Zionist community. Together with the Jewish Journal, the premier Jewish newspaper of Los Angeles, and the Israel Project, which is at the forefront of making sure that the truth is told about Israel. And so our coming together here tonight is meaningful because it says that we deeply care about the future of Israel, but also about the future of the United States of America. And since we care, we want to gain the knowledge about the realities, because when we have knowledge, so then we could be prouder, we could share that knowledge with others, and we could also better affect change. You know, this week the Jewish community worldwide is reading the portion of the spies who return with a negative and biased report about the land of Israel. And the report feeds the fears of the people that leads to despair and resignation. And the story, I think, teaches us two lessons that are relevant for our theme tonight. The first is to be aware of the dangerous consequences when people distort or ignore the truth. And secondly, the Kotzker Rebbe taught that the mistake of the Jews at that time was not that they lacked faith in God, it was not that they lacked the love of the land of Israel, but rather they lacked faith in themselves. They didn't think that they had the military might to be victorious. They didn't think that they had the spiritual level, that they were on the level to merit the providence of God. In short, they believed in God, but they didn't believe in themselves. And tonight we keep both of those elements in mind, and we strive to be like the righteous Yehoshua and Kalev to counter those elements. First, we reassert our commitment to understand and publicize the truth about Israel and the Middle East, as many out there are trying to distort it. And secondly, we need to have faith as individuals, faith in ourselves, and the important role we can play in shaping our future. And nationally, you don't need me to tell you that we face many challenges and threats from Iran, ISIS, Hamas, the growing BDS movement on campuses, but also worldwide. And with these challenges, and with the ongoing negotiations with Iran, that's on our minds and we're very, very concerned about. So tonight we grapple with the question of whether we have faith in asserting our strength. Are we asserting our capabilities to strengthen our allies, to weaken our adversaries, and to make sure to bring freedom, security, and peace to the region and throughout the world? And so we look forward to an exciting and important conversation tonight. It is so great to join together with all of you here at Beth Jacob. Thank you so much to the Jewish Journal and to the Israel Project and to David for calling me several weeks ago about this phenomenal idea. Look, it's hard to predict the future, but what we do know is that the more that we know, and the more that we care, and the more that we learn, and the more that we're involved, and the more that we have faith, so the better off that we're going to be. So it's a pleasure now to introduce my good friend, enjoy the rest of the evening, a wonderful writer and a great mensch, the president of Tribe Media and the Jewish Journal, David Suissa.
Thank you, Rabbi. Welcome, everyone. Only Jews get together on a Sunday night. Talk about all the crazy news, politics. He's already said a few things about Bret Stephens and the Israel Project. I want to add one little thing. First of all, is Janine Lowy in the audience? I want to thank the Lowy family. They're big supporters of the Jewish Journal. And I hope they're here. My brother, Selwyn Gerber, who graciously agreed to co-sponsor the evening. I want to say a public thank you to Bret Stephens. He doesn't know this, I've never told him, but I'll tell him tonight in public. A few years ago, he spoke at Beth. And near the end of his talk, he said something I'll never forget. He said, we need to make the liberal case for Israel. And it stuck with me. I think I've written 3 or 4 columns just on that. And the reason I bring that up is if you know anything about the Jewish Journal, we're not exactly far right-wing newspaper. But I'm in there, and I'm sort of surrounded by that very wonderful liberal energy. And once in a while, you'll get a strong right-wing conservative writer that will get the attention of liberals. There are very, very few. In fact, I think there are 2 in the country. There's Charles Krauthammer, and there's Bret Stephens. So there's no greater joy in my life than to hear a great liberal say, man, that was a great piece by Stephens. So I've taken that to heart. And I think that the genius of Bret is not that he's able to tell us the things we already know and that we know we're going to agree with. The genius is that he's able to speak to the other side in a way that they will understand. He might not change their minds, but he certainly opens their minds. And there's nothing, I think, more important right now, the situation we're in. So I do want to mention, I used to read Bret when he was at J-Post, in case some of you don't know. He was the youngest editor-in-chief, History of Jerusalem Post, at 28 years old. Which is a big Yeshua. He also, it's a big mitzvah. His book that I read last year, which is really incredible, I highly recommend it. It's called American Retreat, The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder. As soon as you leave tonight, get on Amazon and order the book. It's highly acclaimed. And again, some of my liberal friends have said it's a great book. So once again, America in Retreat. Please get the book. It's worth it. Get some extra copies, Hanukkah presents. I promised you, Bret, I would do this, and I mean it. And the most important thing I'll say about Bret is, you know, over the years I've heard him many times, and one of the questions that often asked is Stephens a Jewish name? So it turns out it's a very, very, very Jewish name. His grandfather's name was Ehrlich, and he decided to change it to Stephens. I'm not sure why, but it's in Wikipedia. You can check me out. So the point I'm making is that Bret Stephens is a wonderful, incredible Jew. And both his parents are Jewish, and we love him, and he represents us better than any writer in America. So, now Josh Block. I didn't know Josh. About 3 years ago, I met Josh at the Herzliya conference in Israel. And it was right out of a Woody Allen movie. He was on his cell phone. Within 5 minutes, he got on the phone with the head of AIPAC, Howard Shore, a congressman, and the White House. I saw it. I was a witness. Josh is one of the most connected lobbyists, not a lobbyist, political individual, macher in Washington, D.C. He's got quite a history. He worked for the Clinton administration. He represented he was a spokesperson for the Gore Clinton and the Lieberman campaigns. He's been doing politics in Washington for the past 20 years, spends almost 10 years at AIPAC in a very senior position. But the greatest thing right now about Josh Block is that he took an organization called the Israel Project. It was an organization that had a decent reputation, working a lot with the press around the world, and something magic happened in the last couple of years. Maybe it's the fact that I get about 2 messages from them every day, whether I'm on Facebook or Twitter or on email, but it's extraordinary. They have released a number of very powerful videos, and they are now the premier pro-Israel organization, certainly fighting against the Iran deal right now. And any top issue right now that's relative to Israel, they're at the forefront. So he's really revolutionized this organization, in which, when he calls it the Israel Project, he really means the Israel Project, and we owe him a big thank you for that. So, I don't think we're going to see too many arguments tonight. I hate to disappoint you. We're going to have a great conversation, and it's with great pleasure, on behalf of the Jewish Journal, the Israel Project, Selwyn Gerber, and everyone, to welcome Bret Stephens and Josh Block.
Good evening. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Rabbi Topp, thank you for your hospitality. The Gerbers, thank you for your sponsorship. David, thank you for those kind words. And thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure. Wonderful to be with you tonight. It's nice to come back and visit LA. Yeah, Bret and I are not used to such sunny, beautiful weather. When it is this way, it's usually much more humid and unpleasant, so it's nice to be here. Do we want to just get going here? Anything you want to start with before I ask you a question?
I feel like the figurines on top of a wedding cake.
I was going to say something similar. Which one of us is the bride? Which one's the groom?
It's a very California
wedding. I don't know. Yeah, very California wedding, right? Progressives. So we're here in a temple. I feel like it's fitting to begin with a conversation about something that took place in a temple not long ago. President Obama gave a speech in a synagogue in Washington, D.C. a week ago or so. It was a speech that in some ways was remarkable. It's not that often that a president of the United States decides he wants to speak to a Jewish audience in a Jewish house of worship. It's a notable thing. He also said he said some things in the speech that were notable, including the fact that he considers himself to be the first Jewish president.
I've often pointed out, this is one of my sort of aphorisms, that when you expect everything of someone, you forgive them nothing. And when you expect nothing of someone, you forgive them everything. And the president is enunciating a position that he expects everything of Israel, and so should it fall short even by an inch or a foot, he will forgive them nothing. Whereas the view of the Palestinians is they can transgress again and again and again, and yet somehow still think of themselves and be treated as entitled to international respectability, receptions at the White House, and statehood. And there's something profound, not only perverse, but dehumanizing about that attitude. Dehumanizing toward Jews and dehumanizing towards Palestinians.
So one of the things he said in the interview, or in the speech, and then in the interviews about the same topic, was that he thinks it's pernicious to discourage public disputes between the United States and Israel. He actually suggested that the fundamentals of the ally-to-ally relationship between the United States and England or Canada or France, we settle our differences in private. And the president said that the notion that we should settle our differences in private with Israel rather than airing them publicly is a pernicious argument. What do you think that means about his view of what for him would be a normal relationship with Israel? He says that means I love you, you're my friend, I should be able to tell you what I think. but it has profound policy consequences. Does he not, do you think he doesn't recognize that or wants those consequences? What is the thought there?
One of the things that I find so distressing, and I really thought it was appalling. There's no other word for it. What are the kinds of conversations? I mean, presumably Great Britain is America's best friend. We have a special relationship with the Brits stretching back well over certainly the last 70 years.
Since we beat them, but yeah.
If not longer than that. Since when does the president say, you know, David Cameron, my good friend, I feel I need to be frank with you. We need to talk openly about your monarchy. We need to talk openly about your whatever.
Yeah.
It would be unthinkable. Or to say, or to behave likewise, to say, I don't know, Jordan. Let's have a conversation with King Abdullah of Jordan about honor killings in Jordan, and let's really air it in public. Let's have the president, because he's a champion of women's rights, really talk about the failure of the Jordanian state to stop the honor killing of women that's so pervasive in that state. No, it somehow falls to Barack Obama, our self-declared first Jewish president, which makes sense because he thinks he's Jesus. I'm going to get into all kinds of trouble tonight.
Is this on film?
To have this, and one of the reasons it's so damaging is that precisely when you have a friendship, that's the time to air the differences, should you have them, privately. At least air them privately for as long as you can before they have to become public. I mean, that's a sensible diplomatic way of having a serious relationship. Otherwise, maybe I should say to the president, you know, the next time you and Mrs. Obama have an argument, we would like to know more about this, you know, because if airing dirty laundry is the secret to a sustainable relationship, why don't you set the example?
So in a column this week, David wrote something about this same set of remarks in which he noted that in the speech, when the president is asked or speaks of the peace process, he doesn't bring up the Palestinians. And when he does speak about this, he speaks of Israel's responsibility. And I think this is a very insightful thing you put. He said, you know, when you speak of responsibility, you put the responsibility on Israel, you're also placing the blame on Israel. And I wonder whether, you can help us sort through what you think the president's ambition is for the next 18 months with regard to Israel and the peace process. He says he doesn't see the prospect of a framework agreement. On the other hand, he doesn't rule out the possibility of supporting a UN resolution that would potentially alter 242 and 338 as the foundation for peacemaking. What is it that he's doing? You know, one last question with this. He says, you can't forget what Prime Minister Netanyahu said in the days before the election, when in an interview he was asked about the regional consequences of tumult and these things. When the Iranians say death to America, it's for domestic purposes, including what they say it on the English Twitter feed for Americans. But when Netanyahu makes a remark that's really he's not even volunteering a notion, he's agreeing with the idea that it's maybe unstable to make a Palestinian state in the midst of this turmoil and their unwillingness to make a compromise, that is unforgivable and changes the way he looks at policy making.
Well, I think what we are witnessing is the unstated radicalism of the Obama administration, now untethered from electoral consideration.
Wasn't it I think one of his advisors was really quoted as saying he's letting his freak flag fly. That was a quote in an article.
If you just watched the Obama's the conversation at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where he had his comic double, I forgot the guy's name, who was sort of Obama's inner rage machine. It was quite, I don't think unwittingly revealing, quite wittingly revealing that this is an administration that thinks we have 18 months to do as we please, and to govern effectively without without taking into account the considerations of Congress, or of our allies, to simply rule as we see fit. The first example of this is this Iranian negotiation, which has gotten increasingly divorced from reality. I don't think I'm the first person to have made this observation. But then also it's his policy toward Israel. And by the way, one of the interesting things, when you go around much of the Arab world, I was in Egypt, I interviewed the president of Egypt a couple of months ago, talking to a lot of people, Saudis, Emiratis. They see, first of all, and we should get into this at some point, how strategically aligned their views are with Israel. But they're also looking at the administration's behavior toward Israel and saying, if this is how the Americans behave towards their good friend Israel, how are they going to behave towards us? So what the president is doing isn't ingratiating himself with Arabs. In fact, he's making them quite nervous, because it shows that his protestations of friendship and alliance are perfectly meaningless. This is deeply damaging to the United States, whether it's Hillary or someone else who becomes the next president. They are going to have to somehow persuade these allies or former allies that we are a dependable superpower. And the president is on a kind of almost personal, almost nihilistic mission to demonstrate that he does not care what the reputation of the United States should be on January 22nd of 2017.
So it's interesting. I was in Israel in March during the week of the elections. And Tip had an event the night of the elections in which the journalists who were covering the election come, Israeli officials and experts come, diplomats from all kinds of countries come. The Egyptians flew two folks from the Foreign Ministry in Cairo to the event. The Jordanian ambassador and his deputy were there, and the French ambassador, the Dutch ambassador, these folks. Lots of elected officials, lots of for generals and formers, lots of journalists. And after the election results come out at 10 p.m., the reporters retire to a filing center and they write their stories. The election results come on TV, and they were a surprise. Netanyahu had performed better than people had anticipated. The labor camp thought they were going to win. When the results came on TV, there was an audible gasp in the room. And when you looked around, what you found was that the only people in the room who were particularly happy, actually, with the results were the Jordanians and the Egyptians. And it reminded me of something that had happened in Washington just a couple weeks before. Sisi had been in Washington not long before, and he'd had a meeting with a former high-ranking Obama official. And in the conversation, he says to him, "So I want to thank you." And the former official looks a little puzzled, and he says, "What?" He says, "Yes, I want to thank you." The guy says, "Well, sure, of course." He says, "Well, I want to thank you for helping us keep our peace with Israel." And the guy says, "Well, of course, it's very important. We're so glad very important." He says, "Yes, I want to thank you for helping us keep the peace with Israel, because our security relationship with them is so much more important to us these days than our relationship with you." And it also reminds me that the King of Jordan had been in Washington not long before, and in every meeting, particularly on Capitol Hill that he had, he referred to Jordanian, Egyptian, Israeli security in a triumvirate. And this week in Washington, Dory Gold, who today, I just got an email that the Israeli cabinet meeting took place today, it's Sunday, he was affirmed as the Director General of their foreign ministry. The last act that he undertook as a private citizen before entering the Israeli government at this high-ranking position was to have an event at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., in which he and a high-ranking former Saudi general stood on a stage together, shook hands, and gave speeches that sounded very similar about the situation with Iran. When you think of the region and these changes that are taking place, what do you think the possibilities are of this kind of alignment between Israel and the Arabs as we go forward? Is that an accidental benefit of Obama's policy?
Yes, Obama finally paved the way towards peace in the Middle East by so thoroughly disenchanting Jews and Arabs about the U.S.
They run into his arms with each other, right?
It's not entirely a joke. There's some real truth. And look, I talk to a lot of Saudis and certainly a lot of Egyptians, and there is a perfect, if you were drawing a Venn diagram, you'd have just a single circle, so to speak. in terms of the strategic vision of Egypt, of Cairo, Jerusalem, Amman, Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi, certainly, with respect to the Iranians, with respect to the Houthis, with respect to Hezbollah, with respect to ISIS, with respect to Assad, with respect to Hamas, and frankly, with respect to the Palestinians. And so that creates a real strategic possibility. It was the kind of confluence of views that drove Sadat to fly to Israel in 1977. Now, whether the Arabs are prepared to act on that, I think is open to question. And of course, if you had intelligent leadership in Washington, they could help galvanize that. I'm not sure, I'm trying to be diplomatic, we have the most intelligent leadership that we need right now in Washington. But how would you, how could you do that? You know, you could say, we are going to have an agreement in principle on the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, and then leave the implementation of it for God knows when. And in the meantime, let's get some business done together. And that might be an approach. I'm skeptical because, after all, Saudi Arabia, despite my sense that strategically they see the world in some sense the way I do, let's not forget it's a horrible, despotic regime that lashes liberal bloggers and has espoused a Wahhabi vision of the world, which has ultimately been the incubator of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS, and all of the Sunni extremism that's exploding throughout the region. So can this new King Salman's regime, and more to the point, the crown prince and his son, can they overcome Saudi Arabia's internal ideological? Can they tamp down the venom and create a new open strategic condominium with the Israelis? They have to remember that the story of Sadat ends in October 1981 with the assassination of Sadat, and they're mindful of that.
So it seems to me that there are a lot of areas in that I want to be sure that we cover, but there's one thing that I think is worth thinking about for a second. The Iran, ISIS, Syria mess, there's all these camps, and it feels very confused to people. Who's on what side of what, particularly when the administration doesn't really make it clear who we're with in this conflict, per se. They talk about helping the Iranians fight ISIS, and they talk about helping arming the Lebanese army. I mean, who's what? ISIS. It seems to me there are three camps in the region. You've got the Iran, Assad, Hezbollah axis. Okay, and add the Houthis. Very good, exactly. Add the Houthis in there. You've got and that's the Shiites. Then you've got the Sunni Shiite extremists. Then you have the Sunni extremists, and that's Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and their patrons, which are Qatar and Turkey. And then you have the other part of the region, which is Jordan, Egypt, Saudi, Bahrain, Kuwait, Israel. These are the states that, at least since 9/11, have been fighting terrorism with us. They've seen Al-Qaeda as a threat to their regimes. As the Arab Spring broke out, they looked at Egypt and they thought, no, we don't want the Muslim Brotherhood there. That's not good for us. We want, the other guy. And it was Qatar that funded the other thing. So you've got these three pieces of the region that are divided. It would seem to me to be rather intuitive, given that that Qatar and Turkey are supporting ISIS and supporting Hamas and supporting these terrorist groups, that the White House would look at this and say, okay, well, the best solution here would be to build up the moderate wing of the region and have them be a force for stability across the region. Let's build these guys up and push back the forces of extremism. But in fact, that's not what the administration has chosen to do. In fact, the nuclear negotiations are a subset of a broader effort in which they're seeking to put Iran in a position of being a stabilizing force in the Middle East. And the president has said this in various ways. He's said, in an interview with NPR, Iran can be a very successful regional power. Wonder what that means, A. He's said that, that we should balance the Sunnis and the Shiites together in a thing. What is it that the administration is doing? Why? Why on earth would they be seeking to, in a meeting, there's one last thing on this point, in a meeting with someone that I know who is a part of the Syrian anti-Assad resistance, and I mean the real part that's fighting Assad, unlike ISIS, which does not fight Assad. He's in a meeting with the State Department about a year ago. They asked him, what can we do to convince you and your friends in the Free Syrian Army that Iran should be the security guarantee in Syria after Assad? And he said, he paused and he told me, I said, inside my head is exploding. These are the people who've been slaughtering my family. What are you talking about? He says to them, though, so remind me again, what's in this for us? And they say, well, under that scenario, Assad will only stay in power for 2 more years. So these are the policy planning folks. This is clearly what they're thinking. This is clearly where they're going. Why? Why are they choosing to try to build up in Iran that will clearly create another future of conflict with this Sunni moderate camp that's not going over, rather than siding with that Sunni moderate camp to push the extremists back in the region? Why?
Look, for a long time, there's been this kind of kitchen table debate among critics of the administration. On one side, there are those who think the administration is ideologic, is driven by a worldview and an ideology. And on the other side, there are those who think the administration is just grossly incompetent and negligent. The truth is, both sides are right. And there's this kind of odd admixture between ideological perversity and amateur hour, John Kerry being amateur hour and the president being ideological perversity, or some mixture of the two that kind of explains it. I mean, you cannot look at President Obama's pronouncements on various Middle Eastern issues. Let me think. Al-Qaeda is on a path to defeat. ISIS is the JV team of international terror. Yemen is the shining example of a successful counterterrorism strategy. We've turned Iraq into a model state. Just kind of, Iran has honored every jot and tittle of the JPOE. These are just own goals, because even liberal media will have to say, although the president did cite Yemen as an example of a great success, the country has now devolved into brutally warring camps of pro-Iranian Houthi militia and Al-Qaeda. Otherwise, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play? On the other hand, there is an ideological vision. Look, I think, and this is the theme of my book, the driving foreign policy impulse of the Obama administration is for the United States not to have a foreign policy. That is to say, all foreign policy is in some sense domestic policy. They want America in retreat, because just as you want to shrink, or they want to shrink, maybe you're a Democrat, the carbon footprint.
Pro-America Democrat, thank you.
It was a joke, okay. Just as you want to shrink your carbon footprint, I think the Obama administration seriously wants to shrink America's strategic footprint. We're too out there, we're overbearing. Whenever we get involved, we make things worse. We want, as the president says, nation building at home. All of that is to say he wants to, as the Brits say, ring fence the Middle East and make it go away. And what more convenient way of doing it than reaching some kind of strategic accommodation with the Iranians, which anyway they see as the sole, as the one power in the region that has kind of civilizational staying power. And in that respect, they may not be entirely wrong. I mean, Iran is actually a civilization with deep roots, which is probably more than can be said for the Arab kingdoms that sprang up after the First World War. And say to the Iranians, look, take some of your pie and leave us alone. That's what they want to say. And this is a very alluring notion. Leon Trotsky, my grandmother's old friend, that's also not a joke. Leon Trotsky once said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Well, you may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in us. And we learned that with a Kouachi brother attack on Charlie Hebdo in Paris. We learned that in Garland, Texas. We're going to learn it again and again, that you can't just wish whole sections of the world away. And that's what Obama has been trying to do. He's been trying to tell Americans, you know, if you just have some attitude adjustment, you can just pretend that the Al-Qaedas, the ISISes, the Houthis, the Hezbollahs just don't exist. They're far away. You shouldn't be mindful of their names. Just vanish, please, so that I can focus on creating the great Clement Attlee social democracy that he wants to create in this country.
There was a moment in the State of the Union address, or just after it, which I thought really evoked this. He, as the president was giving the State of the Union address, talking about how Al-Qaeda was on the run and terrorism was being rolled back, it was at that precise moment that the Iranian-backed, the Houthis, were knocking over the American-supported government in Yemen that was helping us fight both Al-Qaeda and the Iranian-backed terrorists. It was an amazing moment of dichotomy to watch take place. We're not the only ones who see this. A friend of mine was at a dinner not long ago with Leon Panetta, someone that I respect a great deal, who said that the president's foreign policy is, and this is a quote, divorced from reality. Now that's a pretty substantial thing to say for a guy who's been your defense secretary and been your head of the CIA and been the chief of staff of the White House for a former president. He knows what he's talking about. That's a pretty stark thing to say. At another dinner in Las Vegas a couple of weeks later, he actually said the president was in over his head so far as, and this is not the exact quote, but he used the word incompetent or incompetence. Again, a pretty stunning thing to say. How do you explain the situation with regard to ISIS at the moment? You know, last summer, ISIS sort of appeared in a way that, at least to some,
the JV team rose up.
I mean, there was a lot of consternation we would hear in Washington particularly from military folks, the flag officers, who felt like they were being told to go fight this. We're going to go fight this ISIS, but then they were not being given any of the tools to do this. In fact, it was, I think, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey, who said this publicly. What is the administration's approach to fighting ISIS, or are they not? Do they think, what are they doing?
You know, when I because of the book schedule, even though my book was published in November, I submitted the final manuscript in June, and the last detail I was able to include in the manuscript was that a group that I described as Al-Qaeda in Iraq had seized Mosul. So the term ISIS doesn't actually appear in my book, even though I write about how bad the conditions were becoming in Iraq. I'd like to say, given that the title of my book is The Coming Global Disorder, I'd like to say that even if it's not up to date, it explains and predicted what is happening now, which is why you should immediately go out and buy it. But one of the things that what I find most striking is the accelerating pace of events, the pace of disaster. I mean, the fall of Yemen, the fall of Mosul was, by the way, that was June 9th, 2014. So not even a year ago that Mosul fell. Since then, ISIS has reached a point where it controls territories larger than the United Kingdom. Larger than the United Kingdom. That's not a trivial parcel of land.
It also controls money, right? I mean, we're talking about a wealthy group.
Just last week, it was the fall of Ramadi. Then it was the fall of Palmyra. Now it looks like ISIS is increasingly winning against the Assad regime and is taking Idlib. The Free Syrian Army has collapsed. This is the kind of pace that when you read histories of the Second World War and you see these events, these tremendous events happening in incredible succession, this is happening now under a president for whom all of this is sand slipping through his fingers. And the president's response is essentially to say, well, they're going to have to sort their problem out. One of the uniquely idiotic things to have emerged from the White House in the last week or so was this view, well, the Iraqis wouldn't fight for Ramadi, they've got to learn how to fight. I get that point. The Iraqi army is not what we wish it would be, needless to say. But we also need to say that the reason we're concerned about ISIS isn't because we're supporting some government in Baghdad, such as it is. We're concerned about ISIS because ISIS conceives of itself as an Islamist jihadi caliphate whose ambition is not simply to topple the government in Baghdad. Its ambition is to kill Americans and kill Western Europeans and kill Israelis everywhere. So it's a threat not to Baghdad, to us. That's why we have to be in there fighting it, not as some kind of favor.
Yeah. And isn't it not just ISIS though? You know, it's also Boko Haram, which by the way is now an affiliate of ISIS. It's Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, and it's Hamas and the Brotherhood.
This is what should be our foreign policy. What we need to do is send out Michelle Obama to come out with increasingly creative hashtags for bringing back the girls and stopping. Don't behead our journalists. Hashtag. And that's a foreign policy. And I have a line about the president in the book. I'm sorry if this seems harsh. I'm sure I'm offending someone in the audience, but you ought to hear it, those I'm offending. I describe him as a self-infatuated weakling, and I think that's essentially it. And I'm sorry to be saying this because I'm also an American patriot, and I don't want to see the United States humiliated. And I don't say this for partisan reasons. I want, when President Clinton, to his infinite credit, took the war against Slobodan Milosevic and fought for Kosovo, the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, which was slamming him on impeachment and all the Whitewater stuff, was the first to cheer the president and scold people like Tom DeLay, who were the isolationists of the 1990s. We want America's success. We are now in a situation where this country is in a foreign policy freefall. And that is a terrifying reality. We're kind of losing sight of it because it's happening so quickly. But we are in a freefall.
So there are two things that strike me. One is that the degree to which that's the case, and I agree with you, and the degree to which people are saying so. Former Secretaries of State, it was Schultz and Kissinger both coming out and saying, and Baker all condemning some of these things, and yet the Congress opposing big elements of these things, and yet the president continues to push forward on some of these items. Let me ask you this. Could you please make for us the best case you can for the Iran nuclear deal?
Sure.
Mr. President.
Yeah, look, I imagine a moment where the president gets on TV and says something like this: "My fellow Americans, it's time to level with you. This whole business about Iran must not be allowed to get a nuclear weapon was pure hogwash." Now, I had to say it because I was trying to bluff. I had to say it because former American presidents, President Bush, President Clinton, had said this. I'd made political promises. But the truth of the matter, my fellow Americans, is that we can't stop Iran from getting a bomb. Or, if I should speak a little more precisely, none of us seriously want to pay the high price we would have to pay to prevent a regime as determined as Iran's is from getting a bomb. So what can we do? We can either allow, so what are the options? Well, we can either allow this diplomacy to fail, in which case the Iranians will go back to enriching a great deal of uranium, reconstituting their plutonium program, and they'll get a bomb very quickly. Or we can persuade them through this deal, through the inducements of immediate sanctions relief, to postpone that moment for, let's say, a decade. Now, in a decade, the Ayatollah Khamenei will die, and new leadership, I hope, will emerge in Iran. Rouhani seems like a sensible man. John Kerry tells me that Javad Zarif is, awesome when drinking cognac, and a great raconteur, tells dirty jokes, whatever. But a new leadership will emerge in Iran, and we will suddenly find ourselves in a new relationship. Just remember that Henry Kissinger, when he opened China in 1971, Richard Nixon, they weren't dealing with Deng Xiaoping, they were dealing with Mao Zedong. but they could already see that that phase of the regime was over. And so what I'm saying to you, my fellow Americans, is what I'm trying to do is midwife a more gentle, albeit someday nuclear Iran into existence. Now that's actually honest and intelligent. Let me tell you why it's completely wrong. Okay.
He's saying let's bribe them to stay in place.
Right. That's
right, let's bribe them to stay where they are for a little while.
Yeah, to take it slow, to take it easy, and over time to reintegrate into the community of nations. And after all, they can become a very successful regional power. By the way, another condescending line from the president, oh, you Iranians can become a very successful regional power. Now, the Iranians say, no, we're leading an Islamic revolution that's going to change the entire world. Thank you very much, Mr. President. We don't see ourselves as a successful regional power like, I don't know, Thailand. Sorry to insult the Thais, because Thai food is wonderful. But let me tell you why this is wrong. The Iranians will say, well, interestingly, all right, we're not like China. China in 1972 had been not just hurt by some sanctions, it had been devastated by 30 years of maniacal dictatorial regime, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, the Thousand Flowers Bloom. Their economy was in tatters. And they had, as their northern neighbor, a huge military power with some 40 or 50 odd divisions, plus the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, arrayed against it. In fact, Brezhnev, or maybe it was Kosygin, had broached the idea to the Americans that Russia was considering launching a nuclear attack on China. That's because of the Sino-Soviet hostility. And so Mao Zedong had no option but to reach a strategic accommodation with the United States in that kind of triangular diplomacy. Now look at Iran's position. It's true their economy is hurting. That's been an issue. But a country that can send children through landmines is not going to be stopped because their economy is in excessive pain. They look around the world. They say we've essentially seized the Shiite portion of Iraq. We've seized. We have effective control of Beirut. We have Hamas. We have Hezbollah. We have Sana'a. We're winning on every front. Okay, perhaps you might say that Syria is now more problematic for them, but basically they are already a highly successful regional power. They are already beginning to get the benefits of sanctions relief because this administration has let it go. So why on earth should they curb their ambitions, particularly when it's evident that the United States, at least under this president, does not have much political will to assert American power in that region? They're knocking on an open door. So they can have it all. They can have the ideological militancy, which has always defined their regime. They can have the position as a very successful regional player. And by the way, they can also have a nuclear bomb, and they can have it whenever they want. So what the president is, I've just offered you, there's a word in Greek called prolepsis, which is the best way of arguing. David was very kind about my comments. I've always thought about this. The best thing to do when you're thinking of an argument is to anticipate the best arguments of your opponent and be able to express them for the purpose of knocking them down. And I hope that's what I've done. So you now understand the best case that can be made for the president's position if you were honest about it, and it's just a bogus case.
So in order to pursue that process, the administration is leading a negotiation with the Iranians. That negotiation has led us from a place where the goals were to dismantle the Iranian nuclear infrastructure, to ensure there was no underground enrichment facility under a mountain on an IRGC base capable of enriching for a nuclear weapon, to eliminate the plutonium bomb factory, as one of President Obama's aides called it, and to ensure that the Iranians were in no way, did not have the infrastructure to make a nuclear weapon. Now, that made sense. A few weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago now, there was some word that the Supreme Leader had died. There was about a 24-hour period that the Supreme Leader was dead. Made me wonder, who's going to take over this country? Is the IRGC going to take over? Who's going to take over? And the Guardian Council had an election for the person to succeed to choose who would succeed the Supreme Leader. On one side was Rafsanjani, one-bomb Rafsanjani, I call him. If you remember, he said, the Islamic world, Iran is vast. we could take a nuclear strike. Israel is small. One nuclear strike on the Zionist entity, it's gone for good. So this is the guy on one side standing to pick, and he's the moderate, quote unquote. And then there's the other guy. It's the other guy who won, the terribly crazy guy, won 2-1 against him. What is the prospect that in 10 years, Iran is going to be Japan? I mean, the fundamental premise of what you were suggesting is let's bribe them to stay in place for 10 years because in 10 years, it'll be okay. There'll be something different. Japan's one turn of the screw. It'll be all right. Is that even a remote prospect?
Look, it's a real prospect because the most pro-Iranian, pro-American people in the Middle East are Iranians. They're wonderful people. Wonderful, talented, creative, civilized people who, as we all witnessed in 2009, are bridling under the despotism that Barack Obama is legitimizing through his diplomacy, bringing in from the cold. And that's part of the tragedy, the broader human tragedy of this diplomacy. We could have an Iran that wants to live in peace with its neighbors, wants a progressive future, that does want to be like Japan and doesn't particularly need a nuclear bomb to do it. But this diplomacy guarantees, at least for a generation, that that's what we're not going to get. Look, if you told some of you in this audience are Democrats, let's have an election, okay? I'm the supreme leader of the United States, and I'm going to say, you get an election. Your choices are, number 1, Ted Cruz, number 2, Rick Santorum, number 3, Mike Huckabee, and number 4, Denny Hastert. Please choose. And then you choose, I don't know, Mike Huckabee, and you'd say, oh, the moderate one because that Ted Cruz guy was just out to lunch, I mean, this is what the Obama administration is presenting to us as the legitimate, somehow a politically legitimate entity. It's obscene because it is once again a travesty to the genuine aspirations of freedom-loving Iranian people, whom we ought to be supporting. By the way, before you stop, let me tell you, you need to ask me a question. I'm going to tell you what that is.
Yes. Let me get my pen out.
All right. The question is, when the president talks about Iranian anti-Semitism and rationality, how should we parse this? Because, in his interview with Jeff Goldberg the other day, Jeff asked him precisely that, how can a regime that espouses this kind of anti-Semitism be a rational regime? And the president said, well, I understand that anti-Semitism at the margins will affect some of their choices, but they still, they're interested in regime survival, they're interested in economic prosperity. And once again, you're listening to the president, you're thinking, if this were coming from the mouth of an undergraduate student, it would be embarrassing but understandable. But this guy's the president, and he's saying this stuff. He imagines that Iranian anti-Semitism is some kind of casual anti-Semitism where, some guy will sort of, mouth off and say, oh, you greedy Jew, or something like that. But otherwise, that kind of dim-witted prejudice doesn't typify that person's total behavior.
Are they going to go hire a good Jew doctor?
Sorry?
That's the level of the,
well, exactly,
yeah.
That kind of thing, all right? This is a regime that has a millenarian, apocalyptic, diabolical vision of Jews, right, in which Zionists, Israelis, Jews are at the beating heart of every conspiracy against Iran, against Muslims. Now, I know you're never supposed to say this, but this is precisely the kind of a raging genocidal anti-Semitism that described the Nazi regime. Now, it's, my New York Times counterpart, Roger Cohn, will say, well, I went to, Iran and, I met the token Jews that they have there, without mentioning that in 1979, when the Shah was in power, there were 100,000 Jews in Iran, and now there are about 10,000 according to the last census. So 9 out of 10 Iranian Jews have fled, and yet this is somehow supposed to be treated as evidence that this is a rational regime. A regime that sees the world in terms of a dark Jewish conspiracy may be instrumentally rational in the sense that lots of crazy people can be, rational in terms of, eating with a fork and knife or driving a car or whatever. But it means that their ideological vision, their ambition, is profoundly hateful, profoundly rational. I mean, just think about this. When a guy like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad says Israel must be wiped off the map and hosts a conference to deny the Holocaust, this is costing Iran a great deal for his verbal effusions, if you will, okay? But he says them because he believes in them, because it's central to one of the organizing principles of the regime. And again, Obama will talk about Iranian pragmatists. These people aren't Danish pragmatists. They're not IKEA salesmen. They're pragmatic. They're not pragmatic. They're opportunistic, and they're prepared to use a certain kind of wily cunning in the service of a vision, which is a terrifying one.
I found it stunning, that a little over a year and a half ago, Rouhani, the moderate president of Iran, right, quote unquote, went out and said, "Death to America, those are just words. We must pursue death to America in actions." I mean, right? Is the search for moderates in Iran has gone on for generations? What are they talking about?
Well, I mean, look, there were moderate Nazis. Rudolf Hess, moderate Nazi. Albert Speer, misguided architect with dubious aesthetic vision. But they were still Nazis, right? Your membership in the party already meant that you had crossed not only the Rubicon, you'd crossed about 5 Rubicons to get to that place. So in any collection of people, even a collection of murderers, there will be the Hannibal Lecter, and there will be merely the one-off character. The Jeffrey Dahmer, I don't know who's worse. Are you going to eat that? Lecter. But this is this desperate search for moderates is a terrifying aspect of the American foreign policy establishment that always wants to find some element of reason within the universe of unreason. And that's a dangerous approach to foreign policy. To get membership in the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, just to take another example, Muslim Brotherhood isn't like, I don't know, signing up for a Duane Reade discount card. I don't know if you have Duane Reade out here. Walgreens discount card. It's a whole process of indoctrination. So you don't become a member. You don't become a leading personage in the Islamic Republic or a leading figure in the Muslim Brotherhood if you're already wildly immoderate by any standard that you and I would consider moderate.
So in the same vein of kind of delusional thinking, or I was talking to Lindsey Graham, and Lindsey Graham told me that the first he's not the delusional one. The first time that under this joint,
this will be immediately succeeded by a competition of who can drop more names in a shorter amount of time.
He said that the first month that the Iranians got $700 million from the West as part of this JPOA, they sent $400 million of it right into Syria. Okay. That's a pretty profound notion. Now, the president in his remarks, and this is the delusional part, I want you to help me understand, he was talking about Rouhani. And he said, when Rouhani ran for president of Iran, he promised that he was going to, make life better for people. Yeah, unemployment was high, and they were going to deal with the economy, and things would be fine. And so when we do this nuclear deal and we give them this signing bonus, essentially, we'll sign the deal with the Iranians and they'll suddenly get $150 billion that we've been keeping from them. Don't worry about it. They won't use it to, do bad things and spread their tentacles of evil. They're going to use it to concentrate on fixing the economy because, you see, Rouhani, he's the president of a country and he wants to, deliver on his campaign promises.
Like Obama delivered on his. Oscar Wilde once said, "What's too stupid to be said is sung." And I wish Obama, when he'd give these answers, would just start singing. So...
Their pattern of argument on this has gone the following way. Yeah.
But this is the thing. It's like, the idea is, well, even yeah, since Hezbollah only gets $1 billion a year, why not give them $2 billion or $5 billion? If Hamas is only getting a trickle, why not increase it into a spigot or a cascade of armaments? And this is an astonishing argument. By the way, it's an astonishing argument in so many ways. Apparently, the president hasn't figured out that money is fungible, right? So if you're giving, the money is in your left pocket or your right pocket, it does not matter. We have a guy at the University of Chicago, Harry Markowitz, who figured this out at a level of a Nobel Prize winning economist. So it's a staggering statement.
His argument, Bret, is it's cheap. He says what they do now is cheap. It doesn't matter. They're sending missiles to this one when they have no money.
Wait till they do it expensively. That's a stunning thing. If they're making this kind of mischief on a shoestring budget, imagine what they will be able to do if you just pump in, never mind, not $150 billion, pump in another $15 billion into these budgets. And this comes down to another bizarro aspect of the Obama administration's argument, which is somehow they can separate the nuclear portfolio from everything else that Iran is doing in the region. But the fact is they can't separate the two because Iran is one country and its nuclear ambitions are part of an overall regional or indeed a global strategy. So this is this kind of weird attempt to sort of again ring fence the nuclear talks, even as, by the way, this is another point. They go on with the China comparison. When Mao wanted to send a signal that he was prepared to parlay with the United States after 25 years of separation and division, he had the ping pong players go and meet the Americans and have a friendly match. When Khamenei is talking about a parlay, what does he do? He imprisons a California-born American citizen and puts him up on trumped-up espionage charges. This is outrageous. It is outrageous that the American Secretary of State, I have a passport, as do all of you, that says the American Secretary of State requests the assistance of all citizens. And this Secretary of State is busy, when he's not breaking his leg, I hope he mends quickly, is busy parlaying with one of his captors. And then he'll say, well, you have to understand Javad Zarif represents the moderate wing of the regime, and Jason Rezaian is being held by the immoderate part of the regime. But if this leads to one of two conclusions, either, right, the moderate wing of the regime is not so moderate, or the moderates have no control or power over what the IRGC and the various other revolutionary groups in Iran do. So what happens? Are we going to strike a deal with a moderate regime that's fully sincere about wanting to curb the country's nuclear ambitions, and then the IRGC will go and do what it wants? It is the whole thing. I'm talking too quickly. The whole thing is mind-boggling. It's staggering. It is such a dereliction of the fiduciary and moral responsibilities of an American administration, never mind towards Israel, never mind towards our allies, towards the long-term security of the United States. It is outrageous what this president thinks he can get away with.
So we have about 10 minutes left. I want to talk a little bit more about Iran. You're getting to a point where I think you're raising the fundamental value proposition of this deal. And we're getting into the closing period of the negotiations. Whether they'll conclude by the end of June or they'll drag into the summer, we don't know. Congress did something very important, which was pass the Corker-Cardin bill, which will require the president to now show us this deal, which they weren't going to do. Now, at the very least, they're required to show Congress the deal, and we'll all get a chance to see what the answers to the questions of the details of this are, and the details are yet to be determined. But this is the question. At what point is this just not worth it? We're going to give them $150 billion. We're going to free them from the shackles of the isolation we've wrought. In return for what? And this is the question. Now, there are 4 or 5 areas, and I'm going to run through them. I want you to tell us why they're important, whether you think they need to be in there or not in this final deal. Inspections. The president promises us that this deal will be so secure because we'll be able to get into places that we've never been before and we'll inspect very thoroughly. The most thorough inspection regime ever, and in order to have that, at least in any measure, you have to have anywhere, anytime inspections. We have to have the ability to go in and look around anywhere we want, including on military bases. Obviously, the Supreme Leader has said that's not going to happen. That's one. 2, the Iranians have been hiding their prior military work, and without the disclosure of it, we don't know how quickly they can get to a bomb, and we don't know we won't be able to know if they're cheating in the future. There's a question of sanctions. When do they get sanctions relief? When do they get this $150 billion? When do we repeal the sanctions or ease them off? Do they get this before they come clean on the prior military work? Before they make irreversible steps? When do they get the sanctions relief? They say they want it up front. If they won't come clean on the military work under sanction, why would they come clean after they've gotten the money, I ask. And then how about this? How long should the deal last? Is it enough that in 10 to 15 years they can have a nuclear program of unlimited size that can build nuclear weapons in 5 to 10 years? Which of these things do you think we need to insist that our elected officials say, this is my red line? If the deal doesn't have X or doesn't have Y, I will oppose this deal. What other things are left to negotiate in your mind that make it just go from bad to dangerous and absolutely unacceptable?
Look, one of the things that I find staggering, again, I feel like being a columnist in this day and age is like being in the land of marvels. We are just fresh out. The great experience, the American foreign policy experience of the first part of the century was the war in Iraq and the failure of intelligence. And yet now we have, after that colossal intelligence failure in Iraq, we have a president telling us we will have perfect intelligence. We will know for a certainty when Iran decides to break out with a bomb. Now, maybe the president knows suddenly our intelligence gathering operation has gotten so fantastically great under John Brennan that we have perfect knowledge everywhere at all times. But as Daniel Patrick Moynihan, an infinitely wiser Democrat than than the president. I was about to say than his successor in the Senate, but that's another story. As Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said, intelligence is never to be confused with intelligence. So the fact is, we won't have good intelligence. We have even worse intelligence with the adamant refusal to open military sites. And anyway, we have a spotless 70-year track record of always getting the WMD intelligence wrong. We thought the Soviets wouldn't detonate till the mid-1950s. They detonated a bomb in 1949. We thought the Soviets would never emplace nuclear missiles in Cuba, and in fact, we had a national intelligence estimate in September 1962 making this case. Of course, in October 1962, we realized it was complete baloney. We completely failed to know that India was about to detonate a nuclear bomb in 1998, and that was followed by the Pakistani tests. And then, of course, the debacle in Iraq. But now the president comes back to tell us, "Oh, we've got this one down." So this is these are some improbable claims that the president is making. But look, that's almost the least of it. Let's imagine that this deal was being agreed to by some other president. It would have more credibility because that other president would probably not have so gratuitously and publicly abandoned previous red lines. And I think that's what really bothers the Saudis as well as the Israelis. It's not just the bad the inherently bad terms of the deal. It's the fact that this is a president who already showed that he's a bluffer. And so why should anyone take him seriously today? The Syrians don't take him seriously over chemical weapons. The Russians don't take him seriously over Ukraine. But on Iran, he's already saying, by the way, after years of saying the military option is never off the table, saying, well, frankly, it's off the table.
He said on the TV interview Channel 2, he said the United States can't destroy Iran's nuclear military.
Well, you see, again, this is a perfect nonsense. I mean, this is a stupid comment. Yes, it can destroy. Now, can the Iranians reconstitute it? Yes. Could you destroy it again? Yes. So if an Iranian nuclear weapon is indeed unacceptable, then that has to be an option that you mean to take seriously. I have a 5-year-old daughter. I often tell her her behavior is unacceptable. She looks at me like, what do you think, I'm stupid? You know, obviously her behavior is perfectly acceptable because I'm never going to bomb my daughter. And actually, she would retaliate in ways that I could not sustain.
Talk about deterrence. Yeah.
So this is very problematic. And to me, the great question is getting through the next 18 months, which I think are going to be very difficult, and also starting to establish a pedagogy as to why we are entering this world. You know, I was commenting, I won't say who because the name is even bigger, if I dare say, than Lindsey Graham.
Well, Lindsey Graham. I mean, I didn't realize I'd provoke the wrath of name dropping. Drop it. Do it.
But no, I'm not going to do it. But look,
John McCain.
Here, I'll drop my own name. I wrote a column in which I made the point that we are now getting to the moment where there is no dialing it down, turning it back. Once we have a nuclear deal with Iran, should we have a nuclear deal with Iran, we are entering into a dark world where all of our options are going to become bad. One of the points that I make, a lot of Democrats, you hear the administration say, well, the only answer the Republicans have is war. That's not true, but it's becoming truer because they're limiting the options of whoever is the next president. What this deal is doing is telling the next president that if he or she really does want to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, then that president's only option is going to be war. So this deal is making war much more likely, and making not only war more likely, but making war more likely in a much more dangerous world, when Iran may already have 2 or 3 nuclear weapons, if not more. That's a scary thing. I mean, the president says, well, we're going to stop Iran from getting a bomb for the next 10 or 15 years. And I stop and think about that, and I think 10 or 15 years, that means for my youngest daughter, sometime between the age of 15 when she's a sophomore in high school and 20 when she's a sophomore in college. That does not give me a great deal of comfort. I mean, that works perfectly for Barack Obama's political timeline, right? But that's not what interests me as a father of a child who is going to have a world in which a regime sworn to the annihilation of Israel, that says the annihilation of Israel is non-negotiable, okay, is going to have the means to make good on its threats. Yeah. And that's absolutely terrifying. Of course, he's the first Jewish president, so allowances must be made. And he, having been the president, understands Israel's security situation so much more profoundly than some schmendrick like, I don't know, the Prime Minister of Israel. What would the Prime Minister of Israel know? Whereas the Prime Minister been all this time when Barack Obama has been thinking profoundly about the future of the entire Middle East and reconceiving the universe. Again, I get back to the chutzpah of the president trying to explain to Israel or the Israelis what's in their own best interest. I mean, at least concede to the Israelis that they may have some clue on this subject. They may have given it a passing thought, and maybe it's not the case that that a guy like Bibi Netanyahu wakes up in the morning and says, "Gee, I see that I have 2 options here. I can either go the way of the wise, magnanimous, just, far-seeing vision that President Obama has so wonderfully laid out for me, or I can take the low road of greed, deceit, conflict, and increasing international isolation that I prefer. I think I'll take the low road." I mean, you have to, at some point, again, it's an insult to the intelligence of people who disagree with them to assume that they're either fools or knaves. And that's not the case. And this is another infuriating aspect, that the president isn't even bothering beyond token protestations. Well, I understand where the Israelis are coming from saying, I kind of see it from the Israeli the Israeli point of view. Maybe they're not quite as insane and perfidious as I'm treating them.
He said something interesting along the lines. He was asked in the Channel 2 interview. He's giving a stem winder about peace, and she interrupts him and says, "But what if Israel had given back the Golan as you were trying to do? What if we?" And then he says, "Well, we've never asked Israel to take risks to its security for peace." All right, we have a couple minutes left. Let's do one last subject quickly, because not everything should be doom and gloom in the world.
Right. There's also absolute darkness.
Yeah. There's a whole other side to Israel. Now, we're the Israel Project. Tonight we're talking about the foreign policy things that we care most about, we want everyone to be thinking about and making sure as we go in this last month of Iran talks that people be focused on. But there's a whole other side to Israel that has nothing to do with all these things, and it's an Israel that you know well and you think of. Israel today, it seems to me, has never been stronger or more prosperous or more secure in the Middle East. What conventional army is going to invade Israel today? Israel isn't even giving gas masks away now because of the reduction of the threat of chemical weapons from Syria. Tell me about the Israel that you see today that has nothing to do with the stuff we're talking about, the Israel of prosperity and innovation. What do you see in Israel today?
Look, I don't need to tell you or anyone in this audience, what this country is capable of and why it continues to astound us and why it has a capacity for renewal and a resilience that I think is unmatched anywhere in the world. But I was, I'm going to, having said that, evade part of your question, because I don't want to just repeat, pill cam and drip irrigation and cybersecurity.
We all know that stuff.
I've been reading a very moving book. I just finished it, and after you finished my book, I recommend it for all of you. It's a book called Not I. The subtitle is Memoirs of a German Childhood. It was by a very highly regarded German post-war intellectual named Joachim Fest, and it's his memory of growing up in Nazi Germany. He was born in 1926. He went through the whole war period in Berlin before he was conscripted in late 44, 45. But he was a Prussian Catholic whose father was adamantly opposed to the Nazis and paid a very heavy price. It was a kind of an upper middle class family, and they were immediately, his father lost his job. They were sort of reduced into penury. It's a tragic and very, very moving story of a truly righteous Gentile. And there's a scene in this book where, among other things, the family has many Jewish friends. And as Hitler comes to power, the author's father goes to these Jewish friends and says, "You've got to get out. You've got to get out." Especially, and this is 33, then the 35 Nuremberg laws, and then even after Kristallnacht, German Jews are saying, no. We've survived worse. Germany is the land of Goethe and Mozart and Kultur. This will be kept in bounds. And after all, the Nazis are nothing if not believe in the rule of law, so we'll go through a dark patch, but we're never going to leave. And the father makes the observation. He says, the German Jews, in a way, the father's a kind of a romantic Prussian in the old-fashioned sense. He says, they're like almost the ideal Prussians. They're brilliant, they're witty, they're wise, they're incredible, but they have one fatal flaw. And what is the fatal flaw? He says, they have lost their instinct for danger. And it's a profound, the father makes this, the son records the comment from, say, 1936, 1937. It's a very profound comment. One of the things that I worry about most of all is that the Jewish people whether here or in Israel, should never lose its instinct for danger. One of the reasons I think an organization like the Israel Project is so important is because that's what you're really about. I think it is honing the instinct for danger. Not because you want to be alarmist, not because you want to indulge in doom and gloom, not because you're unaware that Israel is a country with all of this capability, with this magnificent military that has, improbably survives again and again, but it has survived because Israel is a country founded on an instinct for danger, from Theodore Herzl to David Ben-Gurion to Arik Sharon, and to you. And I think that's the essential point. That's if this whole conversation that we've had on this wedding cake, and I don't accept.
I feel spurned.
Has any point? It's that. That's what I hope you take away from this evening. An instinct for danger, not to be scared, but to be prepared, forewarned, and smart. Thank you very much.
So thank you. And let me just say one last thing to that point. There's a reason that we were here, and that reason is to be with you. And we want you to think about these issues and carry them forward. And if you want to learn more about the Israel Project, my colleague David Hazoni is here. He's the editor of thetower.org and the Tower magazine. He's in the back. Ian Sugar is here. Thank you so much for coming. Please see them on the way out. Thank you so much.